Very good. Good evening, everyone. Due to the subject matter of this and the analysis that you're going to see, I do need to include a safe harbor statement because this video or this file could be digitally distributed. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but understand that the analysis here is not to be interpreted as financial advice, and trading stocks or equities comes with risk, including financial loss. So the background of this actually started with a conversation with Jeff Cohen and I. We were talking about how certain stocks rebound off of specific scandal or bad events, and how those can actually create buying opportunities. And so when we did a non-statistical sampling, we started to see some patterns where the market initially overreacts to what is bad news around a particular equity or stock. And we believe there's two really key factors to that. One is a well-documented and well-written about subject matter, and that is the fear and emotion that goes around equity trading. And the best comment here is that people generally feel twice as much sadness or pain when they lose something of equal value than if they were to gain that of equal value. But the other part is more recently, and that is technology. Certainly in the last 10 to 12 years, mobile computing as well as automation allows transactions to be done anywhere, anytime, or automatically, including algos and bots that trade when certain values get below thresholds or below certain collars. All of this summarized creates this reaction of what is an overreaction to unfavorable news events. And what you see in some of these profiles is a dramatic decline in a very rapid period of time, typically same week. But once the marketplace assessed the risk of the news, they often deem that now stock or equity is undervalued. And that's when the smart money comes in and starts to bolster the price-earning ratio back up. The great part is that you don't have to predict the bottom, which is good because it's impossible to predict the bottom. What you'll see here is that the bottom and the turn is actually, not the bottom, but the turn is actually visible. And that visible turn is what we call the bounce. And so the analysis of this is around the emotional stock volatility of news. When you look at certain stocks, and I chose ones of recent events, you can start to see this shape. So here's Wells Fargo being fined because they created over 2 million fraudulent accounts. You can see this dip and then a quick recover, and then obviously they went on to a 26-week high. Toshiba announcing a misrepresentation of financial results, quickly descended and then bounced back. Similar with Olympus camera, or Olympus. More recently, Equifax, the release of, or the news of 145 accounts were breached, quickly restored at least 75% of that value. One of the bigger ones, Deepwater Horizon, and this list goes on and on. Samsung phones explode, Milan called to a hearing due to pricing of EpiPens, Kobe Steel misrepresented financials, Tesco groceries misrepresented financials, VW falsifies emissions, right? You see this shape over and over again. And so what we wanted to do is test this non-statistical model or thesis with a statistical model. We came up with some business logic, and that is, at a minimum, a 15% decline in a single week equals an event. If there's a subsequent decline in the same 4-week period, it is the same event. And then the bounce has to achieve at least a 15% increase in price value below that low in that period. So to walk through the workflow of this analysis, I'll introduce Harsham.
Hey guys, so we don't have a website for you, but we have something so much better. Jupyter for loops. You'll see soon again. So we had to break this down to multiple steps. Obviously, we were pulling a lot of information, and we had to organize it and get rid of a lot of the excess. So the first step was to sort of find our data. We decided to go with the New York Stock Exchange and like the list of all the companies there. I sort of already had this list because I was doing something with it before, but we took 800 random samples from that. You can see my beautiful work there somewhere. Here it is. So now we get into the fun part, all these for loops and the API calls. Our second step was to pull the time series data for each of these stocks that we analyzed using Alpha Vantage 90%. We also use IEX trading to get the market cap because we're going to plug that in later in our multiple linear regressions, but these are the 2 for loops we used to do that. We even got some error debugging to make sure that everything runs fine. Next step, we need to find the drops of 15% or more during the week. We sort of did that by setting the drop equal to 15% of the price and then checking if the opening price minus the closing price was still greater than or equal to that drop. And then if it was, then recording it. The next step was to find the low point. You guys are probably getting really tired of these for loops, but I honestly love it. It's just great, this organization. We had to do a lot of if statements to sort of like gauge, like, okay, if it's in the first week, we want to record all the information. If it's in the weeks following that under week 26, we want to make sure we're only recording it if it like creates a new low. And at the end of 26 weeks, we want to record everything to show that what our low is, the date it comes with, the ticker, all that information. And then after it gets to past 26 breaks, it's going to break and jump onto the next item in the list. So now we get on to the next 26 weeks of data. We're going to do this a lot because a lot of the times we have to find something and then we have to look at the 26 weeks after that, because that's where like the meat of our sort of analysis will come in. So this is recording 26 weeks after we find the low point, because then we're going to find the rebound from that. So we do that, and we actually do find the rebound here. We set it equal to 1.15 times the lowest point, which is 15% more than the lowest price currently is. And we decided to pick that rebound sort of arbitrarily, but it turned out to have some pretty interesting results. So again, pointing this out again, rebound. And what happens next? So we found the 26 weeks of data. We found the rebound. Now we want the 26 weeks after the rebound, because originally we took 26 weeks after the low to find the rebound, and now we want to find the 26 weeks after the rebound to see what actually happens with the money. And yeah, that's what we come up with the next. We do machine learning to predict the ROI. So we use 6 hidden features. We use everything from opening price, closing price, whether it hit a certain rebound, whether it hit the rebound within a certain number of weeks, and other stuff. And we got this great R squared of 32%. Useless, probably, right? Well, let's get a little more into the numbers. So even though our R squared turned out to be pretty much useless to us, because of course stock data, if you get 50% R squared, you're lucky. So instead we decided to look at the trends. So the first important trend is that if the stock bounces back within the first 10 weeks after it hits its low point, then the ROI just gets significantly higher than in the other cases. Also, don't give this red line too much weight, because more than 90% of the stocks bounce back within the first 10 weeks. So even though this line is here, it holds very little value or weight because there weren't enough sources to give it credibility. This points it out. Within the first 3 weeks, honestly, more than 90% of all the stocks rebounded. So if you notice a big drop, it might be a good time. But again, we're not analysts, so take that with a hint of salt. Take that with a grain. And here is our actual ROIs. So you can see here that if it rebounded within the first 10 weeks, on average, our ROI within the last 3 weeks from 24 to 26 is 10%, whereas the rebound after the first 10 weeks give us ROIs of around like 4%, 1%, 2%. And another interesting trend that's not up here, I also took a look at, instead of just dips and then recoveries, I took a look at just jumps. So if it just jumped 5% without anything coming before it, or if it just jumped 10% without anything coming before it, and the ROI for that is pretty low. It's about 2% after 26 weeks for a 5% jump in a week, and it's about 4% increase in ROI after 26 weeks if it's a 10% jump. So this return on investment actually beat it out by quite a margin. So now I'm going to pass it on and let Sean explain everything else, basically.
Okay, so Harshal explained that stocks that meet our criteria after a significant decline in a 1 week period, waiting for the low to occur, and then looking for our 15% bounce back. After that, he showed that the ROI is 10% in 6 weeks, and the ROI, the stock market in general is always increasing, but over 6 months, it's typically only 4%, so we're about 2.5 times better than the market. But just a positive ROI on average is a good thing, but I think the distribution of that is important as well. I put up a few comparisons as to how much more likely it is we see an X increase versus Y drop, and you're just as more likely to get a 30% ROI than to lose any money whatsoever, whether that's 5%, 10%, 25%. As you can see, 40% increase more likely than a 10% drop, 60% increase versus 25% drop, and then 50% drop is what we'd call really tanking, and you're just as likely to get to more than double your money. So on top of, if you play all of these stocks over time, you'll have a 10% ROI, but there's also there is some risk, just like with any stock, but the distribution skews heavily towards the positive side. And then just general findings, some of our positive results for when we looked at these stocks that had significant declines, no matter how long the decline was, whether it was a sharp drop or a steady drop, a vast majority of them bounced back within 6 months. A majority of those bounce backs happen within 3 weeks, and almost all of them bounce back within 10 weeks. And those 3-week bounce backs are the strongest returns. Those are the ones we want to pinpoint and focus on. And within 10 weeks is what meets our threshold for beating the market. But looking at these numbers, it shows you that once you identify stocks with significant events, you do not need to search for hidden gems that will bounce back and that will perform. A vast majority of them do. You do not need to be picky. You can just look for declines, wait it out. Don't even try and pinpoint the low point. Just wait until you see a significant bounce back. You haven't missed your buying opportunity. You've just waited for the signal that that's starting. Some surprising non-factors, variables that we thought would be important: length of the decline and magnitude of the decline. It really didn't matter if that 15% drop in the first week was the only portion of the decline, or if it continued and tanked 75% of its value over 3 months. We still see the same trends as far as bounce back potential. And also the original stock price had very little correlation to whether it was going to bounce back and what the potential ROI is. We filtered out really low stock prices because those are volatile in general, but after that, there's no difference between a $10 stock and a monster like Amazon or Google. So we got a lot done, and we are very happy with our results, but there's still more we can do. Craig, you want to go over this?
One of the things that we were working to do was to tie the news event subject and categories to the trade. And so we broke it down into, there's 5 categories of this type of news. Product and service failure being one, accounting and financial misrepresentation is very common, environmental or ecological hazard, human health hazard like a Chipotle, or impact to any key executives. And then around that, started to put in keyword searches that we were going to utilize and API calls to news syndications. So the next step was, we wrote those APIs. Let me go back up here. Is find the severity of the news events, and then tie that back with both sentiment and volume, and see if that has a correlation to where the bounce and the rebound occur.
And we actually did pull this data from the Guardian API and tested the results and found absolutely zero correlation. But then we looked back and looked at our results, and the API that we were using, we were getting articles that weren't about the company. So it made sense that we had no correlation. So That's something we need to find, a reliable API but we already have the code to implement that search function. We also want to test more data sets. We've tested a few, and we've found similar trends, slightly different numbers, but it's always the same trend. I was spouting off about our astronomical returns earlier in the week. I'm sure a lot of you heard that. And there's 3 lessons to be learned about that. First, don't boast until you're absolutely sure. Second, it's really important to make sure your data set is unbiased. We did a lot of that, and then we realized the data set I was using versus Herschel had dated back to 2008, so it included the recession and the major bounce back from that. So that's why we were seeing crazy returns from that data set. But that's not completely insignificant. Right now, those type of returns are unrealistic, but when a recession happens, if you have any money left at the end of it, once that bounce back happens, this trend is amplified when the whole market is in a bounce back. Anything else?
Yeah, no question.
So question, when you said bounce back, right, all these companies, like 93.2% companies bounce back, what was your threshold of bounce back? Did they bounce back to the place they were before they went down 15%, or did you have a parity?
No, and I want to go back to Equifax, because that's a great example of why we weren't looking for it to bounce back to the original price. Right. We were looking for it to bounce back 15%. And if we waited for it to bounce back to its original price, then you've lost your buying opportunity, because we're playing off the market overreacting to the decline. We don't think these stocks are necessarily going to be higher than they originally were. Let me just find Equifax real quick. It's the perfect example. But it doesn't come close to its original value, but we're buying back right here. And we still get a significant increase, even though we missed this initial spike. But that's because we are not able to pinpoint the absolutely beginning. We're waiting until we see smart money enter the market, and we're following smart money.
Just make sure I fully understand. So you're waiting for a 15% increase from any point.
No, from the lowest point.
From the lowest
Well,
point.
but we're looking for it from any point, but there are a few examples where that happens before the low point, but typically you still get a positive ROI because it's still significantly after the decline, and even though you're not buying in at the absolute bottom, there might be some volatility in the short term, but over 6 months, the bounce back will still occur.
15% doesn't have to happen in the span of a week. It can happen in the span of a month. 2
Correct.
months, whatever.
Yeah, and what we've found is, well, the amount of the decline period, the length of it doesn't matter. We're checking for that 15% bounce back whenever it happens. It doesn't need to be a spike week, but if it is a really condensed 15% increase, those are the best long-term plays.
You guys should consider, bundling your strategy into an index to see how it compares against S&P. Like, if you were to do this strategy
Right.
if that was your whole investment strategy, how would your returns look
Right.
from 2008 and onward?
Mm-hmm.
The value is the cycles, and that is if the S&P had a 9% year as an
Right.
index, but you could have 2 of these events in a 6-month period, you've been able to nearly double that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's about a 10% ROI on average over 6 months, but you compound that twice, it's 21% ROI versus
Right.
about 8% for the market.
And we also observed where holding a position for a long time creates more risk than value.
I see.
It's better to take the 6 or 8 or 10% and exit.
Ideally, 24 weeks is what I found to be the highest ROI. 24, 25 is like that sweet spot, and then it starts to like trickle down to 26. If I kept analyzing, I felt like if went all the way to 52 weeks out, I feel like it probably would have fell and like risen again. So that's why we say limited to 6 months, because 6 months a lot can happen, but 24 or 25 seems to be the peak, and then it starts to dwindle.
Right.
So you're recommending to short it?
We're not
I'm not
recommending
anything.
anything.
We put the disclaimer in the beginning.
That's not what I heard. What were some of those stocks that didn't bounce back?
Well, go ahead. Chipotle,
Chipotle, yeah.
does not have has that steep decline, but you don't see a 15% off that low for some time. And certainly there's companies that misrepresented financials like Enron that obviously bounced away.
But there's also some companies like GNC that had the fall and the bounce back, and they keep going down. That's why we also don't recommend 6 months, because a lot of these companies are really heading to the toilet. They just are taking their time getting there.
Exactly.
I see a mention about like competitive like advantage, right? So another person or company coming in and offering a similar product like PayPal today.
Right.
So eBay saying that they were going to make their own and stock using PayPal. I'd love to see how that plays out too. Do you think that this would work in that case?
Well, the way we are recording these, if it was a steep enough drop, it would fall into our
Data set.
into our criteria, because right now we are not limiting it by the type of event. That's something we want to implement, is to see if the type of event correlates with even higher ROI, or if it's really a pitfall. If a certain type of scandal doesn't follow this trend, but over all of these events, even before categorizing them, on average, it does really well.
I mean, the scandal has to be like really big, right?
It has to be newsworthy.
Like, PayPal
Right.
decides to release everybody's credit card information.
Yeah.
But from looking at the data, that stuff happens every week when you're looking at thousands of companies on the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
And we only
Thank
picked
you
a
so much.
subset.
Yeah, this is awesome.